The sound of clinking keys and casual laughter drifted down the sidewalk as four white men circled a black woman outside a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. "This one'll cry and run like the others," one of them muttered, eyeing the woman frozen near her car. They didn't notice Amina Lewis crossing the street with two German shepherds at her side, nor did they register the way her hand tapped twice against her thigh. "You need to move along," one said, smirking. Amina didn't answer. She just stared. They had no idea the woman they were mocking was a retired Marine K-9 handler trained for war. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun hung low over the rooftops, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. The neighborhood was the kind that boasted silence as a virtue. Cul-de-sacs that curved like question marks, driveways scrubbed clean of oil stains, and mailboxes all matching in their dull, regulation black. Not a screen door creaked, not a sprinkler sputtered. Every porch light was already on, even though it was only late afternoon, the kind of premature glow that made it seem like the houses had all agreed to pretend the day was done before it truly was. The light was still golden, sharp along the edges, but the hush in the air gave it the feel of a place winding down, not yet dark, but no longer open. Amina Lewis moved through the quiet with the kind of composure that belonged to someone who had never trusted peace when it came too easily. Her footsteps were even, each one placed with the precision of someone who'd spent more years in boots than sneakers. Her hoodie was unzipped just enough to reveal the navy shirt beneath, tucked smoothly into a worn pair of tactical pants. At her sides walked Valor and Echo, their shoulders tight and low. Their pace matched to hers without a word. Neither barked, neither strayed. Their leashes were short, but they didn't need pulling. They knew their formation, and they held it like muscle memory. She'd walked this loop for the last 3 months, ever since moving into the rental house near the end of the block. The streets always looked the same, clean, symmetrical, empty, but the eyes behind the windows changed. Sometimes it was a curtain shifting just slightly. Other times, a phone angled behind a blind. No one ever waved. They didn't ask about the dogs. They didn't ask about her. That was fine. Amina wasn't here to be liked. She was here because this place was supposed to be quiet. She had earned quiet. But today, quiet didn't feel the same. Something in the stillness prickled under her skin. Not danger exactly, but the shape of it, looming somewhere just out of view. The dogs felt it too. Echo's ears tipped forward. Valor's jaw tensed. Their gait tightened, steps slower. Heads lifted slightly as they tasted the air with their noses. Then Amina heard it. At first, it was just voices. Male, casual, laced with the kind of exaggerated humor that came from performative confidence. The volume was too controlled to be a fight, too smug to be harmless. It came from just ahead, where the sidewalk curved around a small patch of hedges and a rusting iron mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. She slowed, eyes narrowing, weight shifting slightly toward the balls of her feet. The dogs stopped with her. She didn't need to see yet to know the type. She had heard that tone before. It was the tone of men who didn't raise their voices because they didn't have to. Men who made their threat clear not with fists or weapons, but with the confidence that they'd never be held accountable for whatever came next. She gave a quiet, low command. Just a syllable, barely audible. Flank. Echo peeled left, moving through the brush like mist. Valor swept right. Pause silent on concrete. They vanished from direct view, but not from range. They knew the terrain now. They understood the perimeter. Then Amina stepped forward, rounding the hedge. She saw them at once. 4 white men, mid-30s to early 40s, spread in a semicircle that wasn't touching the woman in front of them, but didn't need to. They stood just close enough to block every exit. Their arms crossed, or half resting on their hips in a performance of relaxed dominance. Their clothes were worn but deliberate. Mud-caked boots, rolled-up sleeves, sunburned skin above open collars. Their faces held the slack expressions of men who believed nothing could stop them. Not here, not now, not from someone like her. The woman in the middle was standing tall, but her stance was too rigid to be calm. She was well-dressed, navy blazer, slate blouse, gray slacks, and low heels, probably a real estate appraiser or something close to it. She held her purse strap tight enough to show white along her knuckles. Her eyes flicked sideways, just once, locking with Amina's for a breath before returning to the man in front of her. Her lips were closed, tight, drawn against words that might not help her situation. One of the men, the tallest, leaned slightly forward, his voice oozing with mock concern. "Just asking a few questions. No need to get all worked up. Pretty girl like you, walking through here alone. Folks are gonna notice." Another grinned, arms folded across a barrel chest. "Looks like she's lost. Or casing the place. Take your pick." The third one laughed, a quick burst through his nose. "She's probably staying in the next county over, slumming it for kicks." The last one, closest to her, took a slow step forward. His fingers rose lazily and skimmed the top button of her blazer. Not pressing, not grabbing, just hovering long enough to be felt. His voice dropped low enough that Amina barely caught the words. "Or maybe she's looking for attention." Amina moved forward, smooth and unhurried. She didn't call out. She didn't announce herself. She let her presence speak first. The men turned toward her slowly, expecting another neighbor, maybe someone who'd laugh and nod and walk on. Their smirks flickered when they registered the tone in her body. Then their eyes dropped lower and saw the dogs. Two shadows now closing behind them, low to the ground, teeth just visible beneath the still muzzles. She spoke, her voice calm, flat, and precise. "You're going to take 3 steps back, each." The man closest to the woman raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She didn't blink. "You heard me." The third man snorted, glancing to the others. "You've got to be kidding. It's a theme today." "Must be some club," another added. "Women with dogs and an attitude. More like uppity women who think walking a couple dogs makes them tough," the first man muttered, just loud enough for Amina to hear. She tilted her head slightly, then moved 1 step closer. Echo edged forward from behind them, lips curling just enough to flash teeth without a sound. Valor mirrored him on the opposite side, tail rigid, head low. Amina didn't raise her voice. "One more time. Step away from her. Now." Instead, the tallest man pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, not flipping it open, just letting the gesture hang there like a dare. "Lady, I don't think you understand what kind of neighborhood this is." Amina stared at the blade, then at the man's face. She wasn't measuring risk. She was measuring sequence, distance, timing, reaction speed. She knew the numbers. She had run them 1,000 times. 2 seconds to launch. 3 targets within 5 feet. Dogs on command. No warning shots needed. Her fingers moved near the clasp on Valor's leash. The dogs held position, still statues charged with energy, and the air snapped tight. Across from her, the woman hadn't moved, but her breath had changed. She was waiting. The men were shifting now, not laughing anymore. The one with the knife dropped his smirk. His eyes flicked to the dogs, to Amina's hands, and to the exact space between them. Amina's tone dropped further, almost into a whisper, but not weak, just deadly certain. "If you want to find out what I'm trained for, keep talking." Nobody moved. Then one of them, shorter, wider, red-faced from the sun or something stronger, broke the silence with a forced laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lady, you need to calm down. You don't scare anybody." He looked toward the man with the knife, nodded once, and that was all it took. The man lunged, fast and low, the blade flashing as he charged straight at Amina's left side. She didn't step back. "Echo!" she said, clear and clipped. The air cracked open. Echo exploded forward in a single controlled burst, intercepting the man mid-surge with a velocity that knocked him off balance before he had time to adjust his grip. The dog's jaws clamped down just below the elbow of the knife arm, wrenching the forearm sideways with a snap of power so fierce the blade spun free, bouncing once on the concrete before skidding to rest in the grass. The man screamed, not loud, not high-pitched, but raw, broken, panicked, the kind of sound that came from a place below pride and well past surprise. He staggered, trying to shake the dog loose, but Echo held firm, weight forward, back legs planted, his snarl rising from deep in his throat like a rising storm. The man dropped to one knee, flailing at Echo with his free hand, but the dog adjusted his grip, twisting his head to torque the joint further. Amina moved in parallel, stepping just past Echo as if they were part of the same mechanism. Her boot struck the man's shoulder with surgical precision, driving him flat to the pavement. She didn't pause. Her eyes were already scanning for the next threat. It came from behind. Another man rushed her from the right, flannel shirt soaked in sweat, fists raised, thick arms swinging with the clumsy rage of someone who'd never lost a fight. He didn't start. He came in hard and high, aiming for her head with a wild haymaker that would have snapped bone if it landed. It didn't. Amina dipped under the arc, letting the punch pass over her shoulder, then pivoted and drove her elbow directly into his lower ribs. She heard the grunt before she felt the collapse of his center. As he stumbled, she snatched his wrist and spun, twisting him into a tight joint lock that dropped him hard to the ground. His back hit with a thud, air leaving his lungs in a gasp that barely made it past his teeth. He tried to roll. She let him. Then she struck again, knee first, into his side, sharp and fast. He cried out, curling instinctively, arms drawn in. She planted a forearm across his throat and leaned in close, not to whisper, not to taunt, just to make sure he understood. "I warned you." She stood, quick and clean, not even winded. Echo still had the first man pinned. The man's face was pale now, blood seeping around the punctures in his forearm, the knife nowhere near his reach. His voice was hoarse from screaming, begging the dog off, muttering that he was done. He was done. He was done. Echo didn't let go, not until Amina gave the release command. 2 words spoken sharp and low. "Let him." Echo disengaged, stepping back in one swift motion, teeth bared but no longer locked. He returned to Amina's side, posture tight, tail stiff, ready for the next. The other 2 men had been watching, one with his mouth open, the other still clenching that ridiculous baton, knuckles white, face unreadable. Their confidence had cracked, but it hadn't yet broken. Not fully. They hadn't moved to help. They'd stood there, watching, calculating whether this woman and her dogs were worth the risk. Now, they knew the answer wasn't simple. Tasha was still at the wall, eyes wide, mouth half open. Her phone trembled in her hand, pressed to her chest like a lifeline she hadn't yet figured out how to use. She hadn't cried out, hadn't screamed, but her breath had gone shallow, fast, and tight. Amina didn't turn to her. She didn't need to. She could feel the woman's terror and gratitude in the same breath, like a pulse beating just outside her own. The 2 remaining men moved in with the desperate confidence of those who couldn't afford to lose face. Their mouths had gone still, their bravado drained by the wreckage on the sidewalk, their 2 friends groaning in the dirt, one bleeding, the other clutching his ribs and wheezing through clenched teeth. But something darker had taken their place. Not fear, not yet. More like the sharpness of men raised to believe they had the right to finish what they started. Amina didn't wait. She planted her feet and, sidestepping around the nearest curb, edged closer to the stretch of street lined with parked vehicles. When the two remaining men broke cover, she backed up 3 steps and smoothly slipped between 2 parked cars, turning the choke point into her advantage. The choke point was narrow, barely enough space for one man to swing a weapon, let alone 2. Echo circled wide behind a pickup truck, paws gliding silent over the sidewalk. Valor remained close, head lowered, eyes never leaving the baton now twitching in the hand of the taller one. The man with the baton came first, eyes locked on Amina, using its metal weight like an extension of his ego. He swung high, aiming for her head, but Amina dipped under the arc, moved inside the range, and slammed her forearm into his ribs. He doubled slightly but didn't drop. She followed with a brutal palm strike to his chin that snapped his head back, then drove a heel into the inside of his thigh, just above the knee, enough to buckle him. He stumbled into the hood of a sedan, and she grabbed the back of his shirt and yanked him forward, slamming his head against the metal with a sharp metallic thud. The baton fell. He did too, but the 4th man was already coming in. This one didn't hesitate. He moved faster, younger, built with wiry strength. His hands were up, not like a boxer, but like someone who'd been in bar fights and assumed that made him lethal. He threw a quick jab that grazed Amina's shoulder, then another that caught her ribs, but her body didn't react like his had expected. No flinch, no retreat, only redirection. She stepped into the next punch and drove her elbow into the inside of his arm, jamming the joint with a twist. He howled as her boot came up in a quick arc, a sickle kick across his stomach that knocked the air clean from his lungs. Then he reached behind him and pulled a second knife. "Valor!" she said flatly. The dog moved like a shadow unchained. He swept in from the side, teeth clamping down on the man's knife arm before the blade could rise. The man's knees buckled from the shock, his body yanked sideways under Valor's weight. Amina didn't wait. She closed the distance and drove her knee into his chest, then followed with an elbow to the temple that sent him crashing against the side of a minivan. The blade skidded to the ground. Blood smeared the sidewalk now, not gushing, not fatal, but real. The kind that carried weight, consequence. Echo and Valor both returned to formation, circling with low growls, their flanks aligned with Amina's hips. She breathed through her nose, calm, scanning. No immediate threats, but she didn't stand down. Her pulse was steady, her hands still ready. The scent of sweat, metal, and disturbed dust rose in the afternoon air. One of the downed men groaned, trying to crawl toward a curb. Another coughed and spat blood onto the concrete. The baton lay forgotten under the rear wheel of a pickup. The knife glinted, untouched, in the gutter. Tasha, still clutching her phone, had stepped forward without realizing it. Her mouth parted slightly, trying to speak, but the words didn't come. She glanced toward the nearest man, still conscious, barely, then looked at Amina. "I can call someone," she said, voice dry, uncertain. "You just did," Amina replied without looking at her. "They'll be here." She turned to face the 4 bodies sprawled across the suburban street, the porch lights still glowing like distant judges in the quiet backdrop. A lawnmower buzzed somewhere 2 blocks away, indifferent to what had happened here. Tasha stepped closer. "They'll lie." "I know." "They'll say you started it. They always do." One of the men tried to push himself upright, cursing low. Tasha didn't even flinch this time. Amina looked down at him, then back at her dogs. "Stay!" she commanded. They froze. She crouched beside the man, pulled a zip tie from her back pocket, one she always carried, and cinched his hands with mechanical precision. She moved to the next, then the next. Tasha followed silently, collecting weapons, tossing them into a nearby trash bin without being asked. The sirens grew louder with each passing second, no longer the distant wail of someone else's emergency, but a focused, unwavering signal drawing straight toward the quiet street that had just erupted into chaos. The flashing lights came into view like a warning against the still-setting sun, casting an uneasy glow over manicured lawns and stucco walls that had seen nothing of what had just happened. The moment stretched thin as tires squealed against the curb and doors flung open before the cruisers had even fully stopped. 3 patrol cars forming a jagged line across the street, like a barricade that had come too late. Amina gave the signal without speaking twice, her tone steady and trained, as the command fell from her lips in one clear breath. Heel. The dogs moved instantly, slipping back to her sides with the same discipline they'd carried through deployments and drills, their bodies tense but controlled. Their ears turned toward the vehicles as more officers stepped out and scanned the scene with practiced, suspicious eyes. Echo remained just behind her left leg, while Valor took the right, both still as stone, but ready to move with the smallest cue. As officers fanned out around the scene, Tasha twisted free of the wall's shadow and stepped forward to stay close to Amina, now standing slightly behind and to her right, ready to back her up. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held her phone tight against her chest, but her voice managed to reach through the ringing static of approaching sirens. "You saved me," she said, barely above a whisper. "They were going to—" She trailed off, swallowing down the words, then added quickly, "Let me give you my number. If something goes wrong, I want to help. I'll tell them what really happened. They'll twist it," Amina said with quiet certainty, her eyes locked on the approaching officers. "But go ahead." Their phones moved quickly, numbers exchanged without ceremony. The silence between them didn't feel cold. It felt sharpened by urgency, by the knowledge that whatever came next would not be fair, no matter how orderly it appeared. The first officer to reach the scene scanned the men on the ground before glancing toward the woman standing tall with 2 military-trained dogs at her side. His eyes lingered on the injuries. One man bleeding from the arm, another crumpled near the sidewalk with a bloodied shirt. The others still groaning and clutching various parts of their bodies as if they had been dragged through a fight they never expected to lose. The dogs drew his attention next, but they made no sound, didn't bare teeth, didn't move, only watched. "She came out of nowhere," the man with the bitten arm cried suddenly, voice raw and breathless, as he leaned forward and held up his injury like a badge of injustice. "Didn't even give us a chance to explain. She just sent the dogs after us. I didn't even have time to defend myself." Another man, face streaked with sweat and dirt, chimed in from his crouched position near a utility box. "She said we didn't belong here, called us names. Went off like some kind of maniac. I didn't even touch the lady. She just attacked." Tasha stepped forward, unable to hold back the sound rising in her throat. "That is not what happened," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the confusion with surprising clarity. "They had me cornered. They were taunting me, threatening me. One of them had a knife. She didn't provoke anything. She protected me when I couldn't move." One of the younger officers held up his hand, his expression unreadable as he glanced from the downed men to the woman now trying to interject. "Ma'am, we'll take your statement shortly. Please stay where you are." Tasha's mouth opened to protest, but the words caught. She looked at Amina, whose expression hadn't changed since the cruisers arrived, and the silence between them now said more than anything either of them could force into the air. The back door of the third cruiser opened, and a taller man in a crisp uniform stepped out with a slow, deliberate gait that made it clear he believed the situation was already under control. Because he was here. Deputy Clayton Mays carried himself like a man who expected obedience, his every motion measured, his every glance filled with assumptions. His boots hit the pavement like a gavel striking wood. He didn't look around to understand the full scene. He only needed one glance to know who he was walking toward. "Well, well," Mays said, as his eyes settled on Amina. "Didn't expect to see your name cross my desk again. Guess we'll find out if all that Marine training holds up in court." Amina said nothing. She didn't need to. The slight tilt of her chin and the way her eyes locked on his told him she wasn't afraid, even if she was outnumbered. "She was defending me," Tasha said again, louder this time. "They're lying. You have to look at the knife. There's one in the grass and she never touched it. She only stepped in when they were about to." Mays glanced at her, the way a man might glance at a gnat on a windshield. "We've received multiple eyewitness statements and injury reports," he said, his tone slick and professional. "We'll take your version of events, of course, but for now, we're detaining this woman for questioning. Based on the severity of the injuries, she'll be booked on assault charges and reckless use of trained animals. If there are additional charges, they'll be added later." "There's a camera on the corner house," Amina said calmly. "The footage will show the knife. It will show everything." Mays gave a slight nod, one that didn't quite conceal his smirk. "If it exists, it'll be reviewed during the investigation." He motioned toward one of the officers who approached Amina slowly, cuffs already drawn, expression tight but unreadable. "I'm not resisting," she said evenly, then turned with mechanical precision, her wrists presented without struggle. The officer moved in, securing the cuffs around her wrists with a tightness that didn't bruise, but left no room for comfort. Amina didn't react. "You can't arrest her," Tasha insisted. "You're making a mistake." "No, ma'am," Mays said over his shoulder. "We're following protocol." As one officer approached the dogs, Echo let out a deep, chest-rattling growl, low and clear, a sound that spoke of warning rather than aggression. Valor remained still, eyes locked, every muscle ready to spring, but disciplined. "Stand down," Amina said softly. Both dogs obeyed, rising with rigid form and allowing themselves to be led toward a separate vehicle that had pulled in behind the cruisers. As Amina was guided toward the patrol car, Tasha tried once more, stepping forward even as her hands trembled. "I'll call someone. A lawyer. I'll do whatever I can." Amina paused before ducking into the cruiser, her body still upright despite the pressure at her back. She met Tasha's eyes with a look that was not resignation, but preparation. "I know you will," she said quietly. The door closed behind her. The cruiser rolled forward. The world outside blurred slightly behind the tinted glass, but her focus didn't waver. She sat straight, shoulders squared, watching the neighborhood vanish behind her. Not in defeat, but in calculation. This wasn't the end. This was just another fight. One she would win the same way she always had. One step at a time. One fact at a time. One lie broken at a time. The fluorescent lights above the intake corridor buzzed with a steady, colorless hum, casting their pale glow over scuffed tile floors and chipped corners of aging drywall. The sounds inside the precinct were subdued, but not quiet. Phones rang 2 rooms over, a copier churned without urgency, and somewhere deeper in the building, an officer's boots moved rhythmically down a hallway. It was the kind of noise that pretended to be background, but settled inside your chest, like weight. Amina stood still in the processing room, her wrists uncuffed, but her presence still watched. 2 officers worked around her, one tapping on a terminal, the other sorting through the contents of a sealed evidence bag that now held her phone, her wallet, and the nylon harnesses that once rested across Valor and Echo's shoulders. She had already been fingerprinted. Her mugshot had already been taken, twice, once head-on, once from the side. No one had spoken to her beyond orders. No one had asked a question that suggested context or care. She had not resisted. She had not spoken. But the stillness she carried into that room was not compliance. It was endurance. The dogs had been taken almost immediately after she arrived, separated and loaded into a city animal control van that pulled up just minutes after she did. She had watched them through the narrow window of the cruiser as they were led away by handlers who didn't understand what they were holding. Echo had looked back just once, eyes locked with hers until the vehicle turned the corner. Valor hadn't looked at all. His loyalty was forward-facing, always. Officer Derek Ames sat at a nearby desk, half-turned from his monitor as he scanned the incoming report with furrowed brows. The details didn't match the scene he'd arrived to. 4 men claiming unprovoked assault, one with a torn bicep, another with bruised ribs, all insisting they were victims of some rogue handler who set military dogs loose in a public space without warning. The phrasing was too polished, the sequence too clean. The way the report was written, it sounded like the woman had ambushed a group of unarmed men and disappeared back into the bushes like a specter of violence. But it didn't align with what he'd seen. He clicked through the internal case file, stopping at her name. Sergeant Amina R. Lewis, former United States Marine. Multiple commendations. K-9 unit specialist. Overseas deployment log that read like a war map. Fallujah, Kandahar, Ghazni. Honorably discharged. No prior arrests. No misconduct on record. In fact, her last official notation was a commendation for safely disabling an IED with her dogs while under direct fire. Ames stared at the screen for several seconds longer than necessary, reading and rereading the lines, not because he didn't understand them, but because the distance between that version of her and the one in holding didn't make sense. Across the station, Amina sat inside a narrow holding cell made of pale gray cinder block and steel. The bench beneath her was bolted into the wall, the chill of it seeping into the backs of her legs as she leaned forward with her elbows resting on her thighs. Her eyes were open but unfocused, trained not on the hallway beyond the bars, but somewhere further off, someplace behind her eyes. She saw flashes, not of what had just happened, but of where she'd come from. The noise of the base at dusk, the whine of helicopter blades spinning too close to the ground, the pressure of sand against her teeth after diving behind a barricade made of nothing but shattered concrete and prayer. She saw Valor in the field, limping but still moving, his body carrying a wound he didn't acknowledge. She remembered the ringing in her ears after the blast, the scent of burning fabric, the way her hands kept moving even when her mind didn't know where to go next. It wasn't memory, it was presence. That moment was always close. She inhaled slowly, held the breath in her chest for 5 long seconds, then released it in a measured stream. Again, then again, a grounding rhythm. Not to forget, but to remain still. The clatter of boots broke the moment. She looked up slowly as Tasha appeared beyond the bars, flanked by a desk officer holding a clipboard. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled now, her earrings gone, her face flushed from exertion or emotion. Maybe both. But in her hand was a folded receipt and a manila envelope, and in her eyes was something between fury and relief. "I posted your bail," she said, without preamble. "You're coming out." Amina rose without a word. The officer unlocked the door and stepped aside, and the 2 women met just outside the threshold. Tasha looked at her, really looked at her, trying to gauge what kind of storm might be building behind that quiet exterior. Amina nodded once in thanks, but the tension hadn't left her shoulders. "They said the gang submitted footage," Tasha continued as they walked together, voices low beneath the hum of passing officers. "But it's edited. You're not in half the clips. They blurred the dog command, cropped the approach, it makes it look like you just attacked them for no reason." Amina didn't stop. She kept walking until they reached the exit corridor, then turned slowly toward the door, the muscles in her jaw flexing just once. "They came looking for a fight," she said finally, her voice a slow current beneath stone. "Now they've found one." And as she stepped into the fading light outside the precinct, the evening air wrapped around her like a second skin, cool, heavy, and waiting. She didn't speak again as she and Tasha made their way across the lot. The sky had shifted since she entered the station, its late afternoon glow giving way to that long golden hush just before night claimed everything. Shadows stretched longer across the pavement, but her steps never faltered. Tasha walked a half step behind, uncertain whether to keep pressing or to respect the silence. But Amina made the choice for her. "Take me to the shelter," she said, her eyes still facing forward. The local animal control facility sat just off the interstate, a squat brick building with barred windows and a security light that buzzed more than it shone. The front desk clerk barely glanced up as Amina approached, her paperwork in hand and tone sharp, but not raised. A supervisor was called. There was tension in the air, protocols referenced, a few sideways looks passed between staff, but in the end, her name was on the release. And that was all that mattered. They brought the dogs out one at a time. Echo came first, his nails clicking across the tile with careful steps, eyes sweeping the room the moment he entered. He saw her before anyone else, ears flattening for just a breath, then rising again as he moved straight toward her. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He stopped inches from her boots and sat without being told, his eyes steady, his breath calm, as if his body was waiting for confirmation that this wasn't another test. Amina crouched and let him sniff her hand before resting it against his shoulder, firm and grounding. Valor followed next, less dramatic, but no less focused, his body pressing lightly against her leg with the silent pressure of reassurance. Both had lost nothing in discipline, but the strain in their posture spoke volumes. They didn't understand why they'd been separated. They only knew they hadn't failed. That mattered. Back at her house, the door closed with a soft clack behind them. The dogs paced the living room briefly, then settled near the couch where her go-bag sat, unopened beneath the window. Amina peeled off the outer layers of her clothing one by one, inspecting the bruises beneath with clinical detachment. The elbow she'd used to break the man's grip was tender. The muscle along her side pulsed in response to deeper bruising from a rib shot she'd absorbed without flinching, but nothing was broken. Nothing she hadn't managed before. She stood before the bathroom mirror and ran water over her hands, watched the bruises turn darker under the fluorescent light, and then turned away without bothering to clean further. Pain, after all, was familiar, but this wasn't about healing. This was about tracking. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened an old contact list that hadn't been touched since she left the Marines. No names, just numbers and code words. She didn't need names. The men and women on that list weren't people you looked up. They were people you remembered. 2 calls went unanswered. 1 went straight to voicemail. The 4th picked up with no greeting. "I need a background check," she said without introduction. "Ray Brewer, possibly connected to an unregistered gang operating inside the county under a civilian watch front. Known associates wear patriotic insignia, likely using social clubs to mask militia recruitment." The voice on the other end gave a low breath, followed by 2 words. "Still looking for fire?" Amina paused, then replied, "Only if I have to light it myself." 20 minutes later, she had what she needed. Ray Brewer, 45, former private contractor dishonorably discharged after a failed overseas operation tied to illegal weapons transfers. No convictions, but a long trail of dropped charges and lost evidence cases spanning across 3 states. Known to operate on the edge of militia movements and local survivalist chapters, most of them unregistered. Owned a small landscaping company that existed mostly on paper, paid cash under a dozen fake LLCs. Had been under state watch twice for suspected domestic extremism. Both times closed without escalation. Last known property listed under an alias matched an abandoned lumber mill just outside town. That was all she needed. By early evening, she had tracked one of the men from the assault, the younger one with the knife, who now walked with a slight limp, to a strip mall on the south side, where he picked up a bag from a side alley and drove a dented white pickup straight to the mill. He didn't see her tailing him. He wouldn't have known how to look. She parked 2 blocks out and went the rest on foot, sticking to the edges of the tree line, flanking low past rusted fence posts and vines that climbed through broken beams and shattered windows. The place wasn't guarded, at least not visibly, but it had been used recently. There were fresh tire tracks in the gravel, cigarette butts piled in an old paint bucket, and a narrow slit of light glowing from what looked like a second-floor office window. Amina watched from the brush and began mapping. 2 exits, no visible cameras. 1 broken back door, barricaded but not locked. Inside, movement, shadows pacing slowly, backlit by the shifting amber of old halogen bulbs. Laughter once, low and slurred, the sound of boots scuffing against old wood, the echo of something metallic being dropped and picked up again. Her mind started pulling the structure apart like a blueprint, building the route from entry to confrontation, from observation to dismantling. She whispered a single word to the dogs beside her. Stay. And as they lowered into the grass, eyes locked forward, she began the next phase. The moon had risen halfway across the sky by the time Amina returned to the house, its silver light casting narrow shadows through the blinds that fell like quiet stripes across the hardwood floors. The air outside had cooled, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but inside her home the atmosphere felt sharpened, focused. The quiet was no longer restful. It was preparation. She moved without turning on the lights, letting muscle memory guide her through each drawer, each tucked-away crate where old gear had waited untouched since the day she folded her uniform for the final time. She retrieved the equipment slowly, methodically. 2 lightweight tactical harnesses, field-calibrated earpiece, infrared clicker, leather-bound pouch of scent-marked decoys, and a field baton she hadn't used in years. Each item brought a different memory to the surface, but none strong enough to interrupt the rhythm of her work. Echo and Valor watched from the kitchen doorway, heads tilted, ears twitching, as if they could already sense the shift in her posture. She didn't call them. They came on their own, sitting before her with the unspoken readiness that only time and trust could build. They hadn't forgotten what the gear meant. Neither had she. Outside, the backyard offered just enough cover, tree-lined on 3 sides, unlit, with natural dividers of hedges and stones that allowed her to recreate the kinds of environments they had once worked in daily. She moved through it now, with the same slow, silent cadence she had used overseas, stepping over patches of gravel and soft soil, her feet avoiding brittle leaves and loose debris with unconscious ease. The moonlight glinted off the clasp of Echo's harness as she tightened it. Then Valor's, each buckle snapping closed with precision. She gave the first command, low and clipped. Search. They fanned out wide, not running, but sweeping. A deliberate formation meant not to find an enemy, but to restore their own sense of rhythm. Amina tracked their progress by the subtle sound of rustling brush, the nearly silent snap of twigs disturbed under careful paws. She followed in their wake, setting decoys along fence lines and between broken planters, marking them not with scent, but with the small metal clicks that both dogs had learned to associate with threat. She tested their reaction times next. Silent signals, alternate paths, modified cues, and every time they responded not just with accuracy, but anticipation. Valor crouched low at every signal shift, tracking shadows that weren't there, his entire frame coiled with a steady alertness that mirrored her own. Echo leapt a 2-foot barrier without hesitation, circled back when prompted, and stopped short of the final decoy with perfect body control. This wasn't just training, it was remembrance. She paused for water, crouching beside the raised garden bed that now served as a tactical marker, and rested a hand against Echo's side. Her mind slipped then, not by choice, but by rhythm, into the past, pulled backward into memory by the weight of silence that smelled like sand. It had been Iraq, summer of 2007, the outskirts of a town most maps didn't mark. The convoy had stopped for a routine sweep, the air hot enough to sting and the wind carrying the scent of rust and sun-baked roadkill. Amina had been second from the lead vehicle, helmet heavy on her brow, boots digging into gravel as she moved forward with Echo at her side. He had paused, not hesitated, just frozen, with his nose pressed an inch above the ground. His body had locked, not with fear, but with certainty. She remembered the heat rising through her armor, the sweat beading beneath her gloves, the sound of the wind pushing grit into her mouth. Then his head had turned, and he let out one short bark. The world changed half a second later. The IED had been buried beneath the road, wired, triggered, seconds from detonation. Echo's signal had saved 6 men that day, including the lead scout, who never saw the wire tucked beneath a torn canvas scrap. Amina had called the warning. The rest was flash and movement. She remembered diving, shielding Echo with her body, feeling the blast wave roll over them like a wall of steel and sand. He had come out limping, but alive. A streak of blood down his side that wasn't his. He hadn't hesitated since. She blinked hard, returned to the present, and rubbed once at the base of his neck where the old scar still faintly curved beneath his fur. He didn't look back. He was already watching the fence again. They trained until the wind began to shift and the clouds swallowed the moon. Each round more precise than the last, each command answered without pause. By the end, they moved as a single current, 3 bodies attuned to threat, to distance, to the silent rhythm of pressure and response. Amina stood beneath the porch overhang, wiping her hands with an old towel, the dogs now seated at her feet, their breath still heavy from exertion. She didn't feel tired. She felt sharpened. The mill was waiting, and they weren't going in unprepared. The night air carried the scent of pine, rain-soaked soil, and rusted metal as Amina moved through the tree line with the silence of someone who had studied the terrain until it breathed with her. The lumber mill stood ahead, half swallowed in shadow, its rusted siding gleaming faintly under the silver hue of a cloud-stripped moon. The structure no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied in the way that dens are when predators sleep inside them. A yellow light flickered in one upper window, the only sign of movement besides the muted sounds of a radio playing low inside, distorted by distance and warped insulation. She crouched beside a drainage ditch near the rear fence and pulled out the wire cutter from her thigh pouch, testing each snip for noise before working through the bottom row of sagging chain link. She didn't crawl through. She didn't rush. She shifted forward like water might, body angled low, limbs precise, her bag snug against her back, the dogs remaining behind the perimeter under a firm whisper of command. They wouldn't need to enter tonight. This was reconnaissance, not confrontation. By the time she reached the utility box on the north end of the building, her gloves were already on, and her movements had slowed to a fraction of their daytime speed. The panel's rusted lip gave just enough resistance to test her patience, but not enough to stop her. Inside, The wiring was sloppy. Copper bends twisted and rerouted by someone who likely fancied himself an expert without ever passing a certification. Her hands moved with fluid confidence as she located the primary breaker, sliced through the insulation shielding with a hooked blade, and reconnected the live wire through her portable loop charger with enough delay to knock out power for 15 seconds. Just enough time to shift the house into confusion. Just enough to make sure the cameras, if any, went blind for the stretch that mattered. The moment the lights cut, she moved. She crossed the gravel yard to the side loading door, already marked in her mind during the last stakeout as half-rotted and poorly latched. It yielded to her shoulder with a gentle groan that she absorbed with a layered cloth to muffle the sound. Inside, the air smelled like gasoline, sweat, and old lumber. The scent of human presence was heavy. Cooked meat, cheap tobacco, the faint chemical sting of solvents spilled and never cleaned. It was a scent she had known in places far more dangerous than this. She crept along the wall, using her infrared monocular to trace heat signatures upstairs. 3 men in the main room, another pacing by a window in the side hall. Their voices rose in fragments, laughter sharp and unguarded. She really thought she was going to walk out of that like nothing happened. Dogs and everything. Like some kind of soldier for hire. Did you see her face when the cuffs went on? Thought she was unstoppable. That's the best part. They all think they're unstoppable until they're in a cage. You think the dogs are still alive? I hope they're not. Animals like that don't belong in public. Laughter followed again. Careless, unfiltered. The kind that bloomed in places where consequences never reached. Amina didn't react. She simply lifted the recorder from her vest and pressed it on, the small green light pulsing once before disappearing into the fabric. She recorded every second, stepping slowly toward the stairwell, camera angled for distance audio. She didn't need to get close. The room's insulation was thin, and the acoustics bounced just right off the exposed rafters. She moved next to the far end of the hall, where the long oak table sat cluttered with gear. Flashlights, half-full bottles, cell phones, and a few weapons left out like trophies. She reached into her pack and retrieved the device, its casing no bigger than a palm, the pin already loosened but not pulled. She placed the flashbang at the far corner beneath a tangle of cords, then tucked a crushed soda can over it to mask the shell's curve. It wouldn't harm them, only scatter them. That was the point. With the timer set to a 15-second trigger once armed, she stepped back, adjusted her footing, and retraced her entry with the same patience she had come in with. She moved past crates marked with phony cereals, overboards warped by rain and time, and out into the open night once more before finally slipping back under the fence and into the dark belly of the woods. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The flashbang detonated 2 minutes later, sending a thunderclap through the surrounding trees and a shock of white light that burst through the mill's window like lightning. The startled shouts came immediately after, tangled in panic and confusion. She heard the slam of boots stumbling downstairs, the thud of someone tripping over a bench, and a string of loud voices echoing out into the open air. A voice shouted, "Who left something on the table?" Another yelled, "I can't see. What was that supposed to be?" Then a third groaned loudly, followed by a heavy thud and a frustrated cry. "I think I twisted my ankle." What kind of setup was that? Amina stood just beyond the tree line, crouched between brush and stone. The dogs now beside her again, silent and motionless. She listened, waited, recorded the chaos. Then she slipped back into the dark, her route already mapped, her next move already forming. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. They wouldn't see her coming again. But next time, they would feel it. The trail back to her safe house followed no marked road. It wound through overgrown thickets and silent ravines, places where headlights didn't reach and GPS signals stuttered and died. Amina moved like she had once been born in terrain just like it, unbothered by thorns, unhurried by time. Valor and Echo padded at her flanks, their gait steady, their breathing even. They didn't need to be leashed. They didn't need to be told. The mission wasn't over. By the time they returned to the cabin nestled between two dead ridgelines, dawn had begun bleeding across the horizon. She fed the dogs by hand, whispering praise, inspecting each paw for cuts, each flank for bruises. Valor had a scratch just above his eye. Echo a burr tangled in his coat. Minor injuries, nothing they hadn't seen 100 times before. She tended to them as she would a team, not pets, respect between equals forged in fire and grit. When they finally settled at her feet, she sat beside them, arms draped loosely over her knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Inside the cabin, the printer hummed quietly as a new stack of pages emerged. Names, property deeds, traffic citations, militia membership forums. She had cracked into a network of faces and aliases surrounding Ray Brewer, each one a thread in the tapestry that protected him. Some were petty criminals playing soldier in the woods. Others were more dangerous, ex-contractors with dishonorable discharges, men with sealed records and still active connections to paramilitary outfits. They weren't just four thugs on a street. They were part of something deeper. She was unraveling it, piece by piece. At the same time, miles away, Officer Ames sat alone in the precinct evidence room, the flicker of the security camera looping through old footage on a grainy screen. He didn't trust the silence around Amina's case. Every answer he received felt pre-written. The official report still cited her as the aggressor, despite witness inconsistencies and a mountain of red flags. The audio file he received anonymously played in his head over and over again. The tone, the cruelty, the complete lack of hesitation. That morning, he asked to see the full footage from the patrol vehicle's dash cam the day of the arrest. It had been redacted, cut short right after Amina's arrest, just before the injured gang member began shouting threats from the sidewalk. When Ames asked why the last 2 minutes were gone, the clerk shrugged and said it must have been a corruption in the data. He didn't believe her. He asked to review the animal control orders for Echo and Valor. The records showed the dogs had been labeled aggressive on entry. Standard protocol, they said. Except one note stood out. A handler's signature marked the log, but it didn't belong to anyone employed at the shelter. That was the crack. And cracks always led somewhere. By afternoon, he was reviewing internal complaints filed against Deputy Mays, most dismissed without follow-up. One name appeared twice, Ray Brewer. No charges, no statements, just references to prior warnings and community tension. Ames didn't say a word. He printed what he found and placed it into a manila folder. Then he left the station early, citing a family emergency. The truth was simpler. He needed time off the books. Back in the cabin, Amina laid out a map across the floor, marking each confirmed location with careful red ink. Brewer's family had ties to the land the lumber mill stood on. One cousin worked dispatch in the county next door. Another ran a so-called veteran outreach group that didn't actually have a single registered veteran on record. And yet, for all their camouflage, she had eyes on them now. More importantly, she had rhythm. The crew moved in routines, morning drives, midday pickups, late-night gatherings with the same vehicles parked outside each time. They rotated patrols like men expecting trouble but not understanding how it would arrive. She made her next decision without flinching. The next strike wouldn't be a warning. It wouldn't be a prank. It would be an exposure. Everything they'd buried, every alias, every fake business license, Every threat they made behind locked doors would be dragged into daylight. But to do it right, she needed one last thing: access to their records. And to get that, she needed Ames. The hallway outside the break room held the quiet kind of tension only old buildings could bottle. Stale air caught between peeling beige walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the weight of too many conversations that had never been written down. Officer Ames waited by the bulletin board, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the crumpled paper notices of bake sales and retirement ceremonies, none of which felt real anymore. When Deputy Mays emerged from the side corridor, his uniform crisp and his smirk already in place, the moment crystallized. "You've been poking around," Mays said, not bothering with small talk. His voice had the easy swagger of a man who believed consequence was something that happened to other people. Ames didn't move, didn't blink. "You lied in your report." Mays's smile twitched. "You got a badge and a keyboard, Ames." "I got eyes on the ground. What I wrote is what I saw." "No, what you wrote is what you wanted to be true." Mays stepped in closer, lowering his voice, but not his tone. "You don't want to get involved in this? Trust me. It's bigger than a dog bite and a broken nose." "I know," Ames said quietly. "That's the problem." He didn't stay to argue. He turned, walked out, and left Mays standing there, jaw tight, watching him go. Later that night, the burner phone buzzed once on Ames's kitchen counter. No name, no number, just a blinking message. "Encrypted file. Verify before opening." He scanned the thumbprint-locked folder twice before decrypting it with the string of numbers Amina had buried in the metadata. Coordinates, police reports, satellite photos, and a partial personnel list from the so-called outreach group Brewer ran, most names flagged in a federal database for ties to known extremist factions. Embedded deep within was a scanned copy of a weapons ledger with serial numbers partially scratched out, a flag patch stained with something dark, and a quote circled in red marker that read, "Cleansing the roots so the country can grow right again." Ames sat in silence for several minutes, piecing it all together. The mill wasn't just a hideout, it was a funnel, a safe zone for their storage, their meetings, their orders. The arrest of Amina wasn't an overreaction. It was a test, a show of dominance. The kind of baiting that had happened too many times before, now dressed up as law enforcement. The next message came from Tasha Monroe. Her voice, tired but resolute, played through a voicemail she'd saved and finally forwarded to Ames after hours of debating whether she was ready to get involved again. "Hey, it's me. You remember that lady from the other day, with the dogs?" "Yeah, well, guess what? Cops actually booked her. You believe that? I told you she wasn't the problem. Anyway, thought you'd like to know. Ray was laughing about it. Said it was fun getting the dog handler booked like it was sport. His words. I recorded the call. You want the file, or what?" He wanted the file. Within the hour, the recording was in the hands of Internal Affairs. Ames didn't attach his name. He sent it anonymously, but he knew it would land with weight. Enough to force a closer look. Enough to raise internal flags they could no longer ignore. That same night, on the edge of the mill's property, a soft thud echoed through the back lot, barely louder than a dropped toolbox. Then came the hiss of chemical smoke as a distraction device, buried beneath a tarp near their generator, discharged with a sharp pop and a plume of white that sent two of the men sprinting out the side door. They cursed and waved the smoke away, blind and disoriented, unaware of the shadow that moved silently through the gap in the rear loading dock. Amina's boots made no sound against the warped floorboards. She slipped between beams and stairwells like memory, her route pre-mapped and precise. The office sat upstairs, behind a battered steel door that didn't quite shut flush. She slid inside, bypassed the deadbolt, and scanned the shelves for what she needed. 3 locked ammo boxes, 2 file crates, and a reinforced drawer that took her 20 seconds to open with a tension wrench and a steady hand. Inside were the ledger books, 3 in total. The first tracked fuel and equipment, the second listed security codes. The third was more cryptic: partial payments, weapon models, meeting logs, all in shorthand and symbols. One page bore a crude sketch of the same hate symbol tattooed on the hand of the man who had first lunged at her in the street. Another page referenced payment received for handling dogs with prejudice. She didn't smile. She didn't pause. She just photographed everything, downloaded the contents of the desktop hard drive, and placed a small traceable GPS tracker in the spine of the binder labeled Donors. Let them try to run. She'd know where they went. As the smoke in the lot began to clear and the voices outside turned sharper, Amina slipped out the same way she came, vanishing into the tree line with the weight of proof strapped to her back and a hand resting on Valor's shoulder. The records room was never quiet the way a place of knowledge should be. The old courthouse basement buzzed with the tired hum of fluorescent lights and the slow churn of forgotten history etched into manila folders, microfilm reels, and metal filing cabinets with locks nobody had bothered to change in decades. Officer Ames sat with the smell of dust and aging paper pressing against his skin. The file he had just opened splayed across his lap like something too sacred to touch casually. The name across the top read Raymond Brewer, Jr. In red ink, barely visible through time, was a single stamped line: Juvenile record sealed by order of Judge S. Langston. But Ames had learned enough to know that sealed didn't mean invisible. It hadn't taken much digging once he followed the family tree. Ray Brewer, leader of a white nationalist gang hidden behind rural Americana politeness, was the son of Harold Brewer, the former sheriff of Cedar Hills County. Retired 5 years ago, beloved by locals, and buried in enough small-town accolades to drown suspicion. But a name from 12 years back had tripped the wire: Julio Ramirez, 16, last seen near a gas station on the east side of town, last seen arguing with Ray Brewer, then a high school senior already facing suspension for assault. The missing persons report had been filed by Julio's cousin. It sat buried under dozens of routine juvenile disturbances, never investigated. Not seriously. And not since. Ames's fingers hovered over the grainy photocopied photo of the boy. Thin frame, sharp eyes, a jaw set with that quiet defiance that never had a chance to harden into adulthood. The case had vanished like so many others had, choked by the roots of power left untouched for too long. The next discovery didn't come from inside a database. It came from Tasha Monroe. Her voice was brittle when she called, like something under pressure, but she didn't waste time. "There's more," she said. "I've been digging. Old blog posts, community boards, little things people delete when they think no one's watching. I found a post from Julio's aunt. Said she heard Brewer bragging about shutting him up back then. Nobody believed her. The post is old, archived, but it's still there. I sent you the link." Ames didn't ask how she found it. He just opened it, read it twice, then started tracing the post's origin. The deeper it went, the more it confirmed what Amina had already begun to sense: that Brewer and his crew weren't just dangerous, they were protected, cultivated, systemic. That same night, Amina stood in the darkened corner of a junkyard that reeked of oil and old rust, the skeletal remains of engines and chassis piled around her like metal gravestones. The man in front of her, sweat-soaked and breathing through a split lip, leaned back against a stripped-out truck cab, his eyes never leaving the black mass of Valor and Echo, standing only a few feet from him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her tone was measured, her posture calm, but everything about her radiated intention. The dogs responded not with snarls, but with stillness, the kind that felt more dangerous than noise. "You know what this place used to be?" she asked. "Military salvage. Some of these parts were pulled from downed convoys overseas. There's a rhythm to wreckage if you know how to listen. Every piece tells a story. So will you." The man swallowed. He wasn't the muscle of the group. He was the errand boy, the one who ran smokes, stood lookout, laughed loudest when others led. He wasn't built for pressure. "They have a list," he said, fast, words tumbling now. "Names, people they followed, tested, pushed. Some got scared off, some didn't. Kids, too. One boy, 10, maybe 11, they said he was stealing bikes. Ray beat him. They said he got what he deserved." "What happened to him?" Amina asked, stepping closer. "He moved. Or, they said he moved. I don't know. They said he was undocumented. Nobody would care. I didn't touch him, I swear. I just drove." Amina didn't blink. "Where's the list?" "Mill office. Ledger drawer under the floor panel. Marked with green tape." "And Ramirez?" she asked, her voice even softer. The man flinched. "I never met him. That was before me. But they talk. They say Brewer made an example of him." Amina gave a subtle hand signal. Valor stepped back. Echo circled once, then stood at her side. She nodded once and turned away, leaving the man where he was, curled against cold steel. By the time she returned to the cabin, her mind had already mapped the final push. The list. The ledger. The final piece of evidence they needed to turn rumor into proof, corruption into collapse. She wasn't operating alone anymore. She had allies. Tasha with her fire. Ames with his conscience. Even the man she'd just left behind had cracked under truth's weight. And when systems refused to confront their rot, it fell to those outside them to tear the roots free. The server room was hidden beneath the county records office. 2 floors down, past a door with a faded caution sign and a keypad, no one bothered to update after the last renovation. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow on the rows of humming towers caged in steel racks. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a place too quiet to be dangerous, too cold to carry weight. But Amina moved through it with purpose, her every step aligned to a sequence long etched into her instincts. She wore black from boots to collar. Nothing flashy, nothing reflective. Her pack sat flush against her back, lightened to essentials. The stolen access card she'd copied days earlier clicked into the panel like it had always belonged. The lock disengaged with a soft tone, and the far cabinet, containing the network's primary root server, unlatched with a hiss of air pressure. Her fingers moved across the keys with calculated speed, navigating directories and masked subfolders, tracing the routes she'd already mapped in her off-grid setup. She bypassed 2 system flags, scrubbed her trace, and uploaded the compiled evidence, a trove of documents, videos, scanned files, and audio recordings that laid bare everything Brewer and his men had built. The attacks, the symbols, the weapons ledgers, the coded names, the payments, and the complicity. Names that had always existed behind whispers now had digital proof. The list stretched longer than she'd imagined. The final file she added wasn't for law enforcement. It was for the public, a pre-assembled drop labeled Operation White Veil Internal Network Exposure. She set it on a 36-hour trigger, secured to a location-independent cloud relay. If anything happened to her, it would go live, unfiltered, everywhere. The moment it uploaded, she closed the cabinet, locked the door behind her, and disappeared into the street, like a shadow peeling off from the wall. The city lights blinked on overhead as she vanished down an alley, the air cool, the sky taut with coming consequence. That night, she charted the terrain around the gang's new meeting place, a run-down hunting cabin deep in the woods north of the county line. The kind of place that didn't show up on Google Earth without a lot of zoom and luck. She circled it twice from a distance, mapped the blind spots in their perimeter, the rusted propane tank behind the tool shed, the loose paneling on the cabin's north side, the soundproofing they'd attempted with old insulation boards. She noted the boots at the door, the vehicles parked behind the ridge, the beer cans stacked high in a plastic tub. They were settled in, confident again, believing that Amina had disappeared or been swallowed up by the legal system they had used so many times before as their shield. But Amina didn't sleep that night. Neither did her dogs. Back at the station, Officer Ames sat in silence across from Internal Affairs. His badge had already been removed from his chest and placed in a plain envelope on the table. The lead investigator didn't mince words. "You've been communicating with a wanted fugitive." "Wrongfully accused," Ames replied, his voice calm, his spine unbending. "You've sent internal documents to an outside source. I leaked the truth. If that's a problem, we have a different issue." "You're done here, officer." He stood without answering, walked out with his head high, and didn't look back. His phone buzzed once in his pocket before he reached the exit. It was Amina. A single message. Final stage. 200 hours. Broadcast if I go dark. But Ames didn't need the timer. He had already taken precautions of his own. Earlier that evening, before being pulled from duty, he had uploaded a copy of the footage showing Deputy Mays standing at the precinct entrance, casually texting Ray Brewer moments after Amina's arrest. He'd paired it with another clip, Mays leaning into the interrogation room, whispering to another officer, "She's not walking out of here. I'll make sure of that." His voice was clear. The camera caught every word. The entire package had been sent to a journalist Ames trusted, a veteran from the war who now ran an underground investigative podcast focused on exposing hate groups embedded in law enforcement. The journalist didn't ask for confirmation. He simply responded, "I've got it. If you vanish, the world hears everything." Meanwhile, in the deep quiet of her cabin's back room, Amina knelt beside Valor and Echo, checking each harness, testing each strap, touching their foreheads as if sealing a pact. Her tools were packed. Her routes were memorized. And her voice, though silent, rang like tempered steel. It was never about revenge. It was about exposure. If the system wouldn't clean its own rot, she would cut it out, piece by piece. The cabin appeared through the trees like a bruise against the hillside. Its walls dark with rot and damp, a single yellow bulb flickering above the front door, casting warped shadows across the porch, where rusted tools and empty bottles littered the floorboards. Amina stopped at the tree line, one hand resting lightly on Echo's back as Valor eased forward, his body low, his breathing shallow but measured. The scent of stale beer and gun oil hung in the stillness, but so did something else. Complacency. She scanned the perimeter first, eyes sweeping across the truck parked at an angle near the shed and the careless sprawl of extension cords leading to a generator coughing behind the building. They weren't expecting visitors. That much was clear. But just because they were sloppy didn't mean they were harmless. She knew better. The men inside were the kind who thrived on control, who mistook fear for respect and numbers for strength. Tonight, they would learn the difference. Amina tapped her thigh twice. Echo vanished into the dark, cutting wide toward the rear, while Valor slinked toward the side entrance, staying low beneath the broken gutters. She followed between them, a silent current moving through shadows, her footfalls absorbed by wet soil and pine needles. At the edge of the porch, she paused, crouched, and waited. Inside, someone knocked over a bottle. Laughter followed, then a voice slurred with the weight of cheap whiskey. Oh, she screamed like a stuck pig. You should have seen her run. Another voice grunted in response, but it was closer, just beyond the door. Amina counted her breath, then her options. She reached for the small switch on her belt, pressed it, and a thin arc of current flickered to life at the end of her stun baton. It hummed with quiet promise. From the other side of the cabin, Echo gave a low signal bark, one short chuff. Contact made. The side door creaked open. A man stepped out with a cigarette in one hand, a pistol holstered against his hip, and the kind of swagger that came from not knowing you were already marked. Before he even noticed her, Valor lunged from the shadows and slammed into his legs like a battering ram. The man buckled instantly, the cigarette flipping out of his mouth as he crashed onto his back with a scream muffled by Echo closing in fast. Amina moved in tandem, gripping the baton and driving it into the side of his ribs before he could reach his weapon. He convulsed once, then dropped, twitching, still conscious but incapable of reaching his sidearm. From inside, someone shouted, "What the?" Amina was already moving. She rolled through the open door, landing behind a broken recliner as one of the gang members, a thick-necked man in a stained hunting vest, drew a knife and charged. She didn't hesitate. Her boot met his knee in a snapping sidekick that sent him stumbling, and as he swung wildly at her with the blade, she caught his wrist, redirected the force, and slammed his hand against the wall hard enough to hear bone crunch. The knife dropped. She spun, caught his arm under her own, and used his momentum to throw him backward into the coffee table, which exploded under the weight of his landing. He groaned, reaching for his belt, but Echo was already on him, jaw clamped around his forearm with a precision that kept pressure just short of tearing. The man froze, breath shaking, as the dog growled low and close, eyes locked on Amina for confirmation. She didn't give the order to finish. Not yet. Another figure came barreling from the hallway, this one younger, leaner, but louder. He had a baseball bat, and the kind of reckless energy that screamed desperation. Amina sidestepped the first swing and caught the second, slamming her forearm against his wrist to redirect the arc. The bat clattered to the floor. She grabbed him by the collar, drove a knee into his stomach, then flipped him over her shoulder onto the ground. Valor moved to cover, teeth bared, but Amina signaled him back with a soft click of her tongue. The hallway pulsed with heavy footfalls now. More coming. She dragged the stunned man by the arm and shoved him toward the closet door, pinning it shut with a nearby chair. Echo retreated to her flank, still guarding the one on the floor. Valor held his position near the threshold, a silent wall of muscle and discipline. More voices echoed from the back room, some barking orders, others panicked. But Amina didn't retreat. She adjusted her grip on the baton and moved deeper into the house. The air inside the cabin thickened with every step Amina took. Each breath carried the stench of sweat, mildew, and rage. The floor beneath her boots creaked like it remembered violence, like it had soaked it up through the boards and was ready to bleed again. Behind her, Echo paced tight to her left, ears pinned forward, while Valor stayed slightly ahead, tracking every sound like a wire drawn taut. From the back room, something crashed. Furniture shoved aside, a man cursing, a door slamming open against the wall. Brewer had heard the chaos. He knew someone had come for him. But he didn't know it was already too late to run. Amina raised her hand, palm flat in the air. Valor dropped to a low crouch, Echo slinking behind the broken hallway arch. Amina stepped forward, calm and fluid, the stun baton humming faintly in her grip. The hallway narrowed toward a doorway framed in warped wood, and just beyond it, she saw the flicker of movement, a flash of denim, the glint of a holster, the sound of breath held too long. Then, the door flew open. The first man charged, yelling something slurred, swinging a hammer like it was an extension of his anger. Amina didn't sidestep. She stepped into him. The baton arced in a tight crescent, struck the inside of his wrist, and his grip shattered. She caught the hammer mid-drop and drove the butt of it into his ribs. The breath left him in a bark, and before he could double over, Echo surged past her in a blur of muscle and fury. The dog's weight took him off his feet, crashing him through a sagging bookshelf that rained splinters and moldy paper. Two more came behind him, moving together, one with a tire iron, the other with a jagged hunting knife. They didn't hesitate. They saw a lone woman in a hallway and thought numbers meant victory. They didn't see the signal. Amina's left hand flicking once, low and tight. Valor moved like lightning, teeth snapping around the wrist holding the tire iron, dragging the man sideways into the wall with a sickening thud. He screamed, but it cut off into a gurgle as Amina spun into the second man, caught his elbow mid-strike, and twisted his arm until the knife dropped between them. She slammed him into the doorframe, then drove her knee up into his gut twice before he dropped, coughing blood and bile. The hallway was a mess of groans and debris now, but none of it slowed her. The dogs moved with her, trained for years to operate in unison, sweeping corners, guarding flanks, waiting for cues as if they could read her mind. The backroom door was closed. Only one man left now. The one she came for. She stepped over the bodies, eyes locked ahead. Echo growled low. Valor's body tightened beside her. And then the door opened, slow, deliberate. Ray Brewer stood in the center of the room, a pistol in one hand and a blood-stained crowbar in the other. His lip was split. Maybe from earlier, maybe from fighting one of his own. His eyes were wild but not confused. He knew who she was now. He remembered the dogs. He remembered her voice. "You think you're a hero?" he said, words rolling off his tongue like spit. "You're just another angry animal looking for a cage." Amina didn't speak. She clipped the baton to her hip and stepped forward with her hands empty. Brewer's smirk deepened. "You want to dance? Fine. Let's see if that uniform ever taught you how to bleed." He tossed the crowbar aside and rushed her. The impact was brutal. His shoulder struck hers like a battering ram, driving them both back against the far wall. Amina twisted out, breaking the angle, and slammed her forearm across the side of his face. He staggered, then swung wide with a hook. She ducked, swept his leg, and brought him down hard onto the warped floorboards. He rolled fast, tried to get behind her, and they crashed together into an overturned desk. The drawer snapped off. Something metal skidded across the floor. His knee drove into her ribs, and she grunted, but didn't yield. Her elbow caught him in the jaw again. 1, 2, sharp and angled. And blood burst from his mouth. He grabbed her throat with both hands, snarling now, teeth bared. She dropped her weight, used her hips to pivot, then locked one arm around his elbow and drove them both sideways. They hit the wall. She twisted, broke the choke, then landed a savage headbutt that rocked his balance. Brewer tried to reach for the gun he had dropped near the edge of the dresser. "Echo!" she barked. The dog lunged, teeth clamping around Brewer's forearm before he could reach the weapon. He screamed, high and guttural, and Valor closed the gap too, snapping his jaws inches from the man's neck. "Down!" Amina said. The dogs froze. She straddled Brewer's chest, slammed his hands flat to the ground, and brought her knee down to pin his sternum. "You called this a game," she said, breath measured but burning. "You made people bleed for your amusement." Brewer didn't stay down. With a grunt drawn from someplace deeper than pain, he jerked his arms free in a burst of desperation, catching Amina off balance just long enough to twist his hips and throw her off. She hit the ground hard, shoulders slamming into a support beam, her body briefly stunned from the impact. She rolled fast, trying to regain position, but Brewer was already moving. He threw himself on top of her, fists swinging, wild and full of panic, the weight of everything unraveling behind his eyes. One punch caught her cheekbone, splitting the skin clean. Another landed square against her ribs. The breath sucked out of her lungs, but she didn't cry out. Pain was information. She read it, adjusted. She tried to reach the baton clipped at her hip, but his knee pinned her arm, crushing it against the splintered floor. He snarled, grabbing a shard of broken wood nearby, raising it like a crude dagger. That was the moment the dogs moved. Echo broke from the frozen stance with a flash of white teeth and muscle, launching herself into Brewer's side. The impact knocked him clean off Amina, his scream echoing through the small room as the dog sank her teeth into his shoulder and dragged him backward across the warped floorboards. Valor surged next, flanking from the other side, his growl low and sustained like a warning issued from something older than language. He didn't bite, but he pressed close, trapping Brewer's legs, forcing him flat, overwhelmed on every side. Amina rose slowly, wiping blood from her mouth, her breathing steadying again as her pulse slowed just enough to think clearly. She approached them, her silhouette framed against the flickering bulb overhead, body marked with bruises but unshaken. "Hold," she said, and the dogs froze again, lips curled but obeying. Brewer writhed beneath them, face pressed to the grime, still panting, still trying to summon words that wouldn't come. Amina crouched beside him, grabbing the back of his collar, dragging him out the side door and into the yard, where the rain had turned the soil to thick, wet clay. The air outside was cooler, wind gusting through the trees like breath over a wound. She shoved him into the mud. He tried to scramble up, slipping twice before managing to get to his knees. She stood over him, drenched and silent, one hand resting at her side, the other clutching the recorder now smeared with blood and dirt. "You don't understand," Brewer gasped, voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. We were just—" "Say it," Amina said, her voice calm but absolute. "Every name, every order, every lie you fed the cops." He hesitated. She nodded once. The dogs crept closer. Brewer's gaze flicked to them, then to her face. Something broke. Not a bone, not a nerve. Something internal. The realization that nothing he said would stop what was coming. But maybe, just maybe, telling the truth would keep it from getting worse. He looked up at her, lips trembling, his body heaving from the effort of just staying upright. "It was me," he rasped. "I told Mays to lock her up. I knew the footage was fake. We staged it. Said it was a good way to scare the locals, make them stay in line." Amina didn't blink. "And the kid," she said. "The one who went missing." Brewer closed his eyes. "We ran him out. He saw too much. We thought he'd talk." "You killed him?" "No, I don't know. I swear, we dumped him outside county lines. Haven't seen him since." She clicked the recorder off. Then she stepped forward, took Brewer's arm, and with one final movement, drove him face first into the mud, pinning him with her knee between his shoulders until he stopped fighting. Only when he went still did she speak again. "Stay down," she said, voice low and final. "You've done enough damage." The rain began to fall harder. Brewer didn't move. She didn't rush. The weight of what came next needed to be felt, not hurried. With steady hands, Amina moved through the cabin one last time, binding wrists with nylon restraints and tearing a bedsheet into strips for gags. One by one, she pulled the remaining gang members out into the clearing, their clothes smeared with dirt and defeat, their bravado long stripped by the sound judgment of consequence. Brewer went last, dragged through the mud like the final truth exposed to air. By the time she was done, the dogs stood poised beside her once more. Valor by the lead, Echo at the rear, flanking the silent chain of subdued men like guards, escorting prisoners of war. She loaded them into the back of the gang's own pickup truck, tied together and slumped in shameful silence, every window down to let the night witness their ride to reckoning. The truck rolled through town in the early gray of morning, headlights cutting through mist and gravel. Amina drove with one hand, the other resting near the stock of the baton beside her seat. But she didn't expect resistance. Not now. Not after the confession. The drive to the sheriff's office passed without incident. No sirens, no flags, no warnings. Just a quiet wake building behind her, a town on the verge of learning what it had allowed to fester behind back porches and polite fences. When she pulled up to the sheriff's office, the scene was already set. Officer Ames stood at the steps, hands at his sides, flanked by 3 members of Internal Affairs and a swarm of reporters with tripods and notepads, twitching with anticipation. The front of the building glowed under soft halogen lamps, and behind the crowd, civilians had started to gather. Neighbors, witnesses, a few who had quietly known but never spoken, all watching as the truck came to a slow, definitive stop. The moment the engine cut, Amina stepped out, the leash wrapped around her palm like a second spine. Echo jumped down first, landing with feline precision. Valor followed, his gaze sweeping the crowd, unmoved by the press or the weight of the spectacle. She opened the back hatch, and the gang members were revealed like evidence laid bare. Bound, gagged, no bruises that hadn't been earned, no blood that hadn't been justified. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Ames approached slowly, not rushing the moment, not flinching from what it demanded. Amina met his eyes, said nothing, and simply nodded once. Then she raised 2 fingers in a clean salute. Nothing performative, nothing proud. Just acknowledgement between 2 people who had seen what the law could do and what it refused to. Ames didn't salute back. Instead, he stepped to the press table beside the door and reached for the weatherproof speaker already wired in. A small device waited beside it, Amina's recorder, the confession still fresh in its memory. He pressed play. Brewer's voice filled the air. Shaky, cornered, unmistakable. "It was me. I told Mays to lock her up. I knew the footage was fake. We staged it. Said it was a good way to scare the locals." The crowd stiffened. "We ran him out. He saw too much. Dumped him outside county lines." The murmurs turned to voices, sharp and questioning. And then Ames spoke, voice level but clear. This was recorded last night, on location at a known militia hideout. Before anyone could speak again, movement to the left of the building drew attention. Deputy Mays had cracked the side exit open, slipping one boot out onto the concrete, thinking maybe he could duck out before the worst of it landed. But 2 IA agents were already in motion. They crossed the lot fast, one flanking the door, the other drawing cuffs in a practiced arc. Mays didn't make it 2 steps before his arm was pinned behind his back, the sharp clack of the restraints echoing across the lot like punctuation. Gasps swept through the crowd. A few camera flashes lit up his face. No more smirks now. Amina stood still beside the truck, one hand resting lightly on Valor's shoulder, the other on Echo's neck. The dogs didn't move, didn't bark. They sat like carved statues, watching it unfold with the same steady presence they had held through war zones, through training grounds, through every trial that had made them more than animals. They were witnesses now, too. Brewer and the others were pulled from the truck by uniformed deputies brought in from neighboring districts, their faces pale and streaked with fear, their bodies bent under the weight of the public eye. No one stepped forward to defend them. No one pretended not to know. Ames turned to the crowd. "There will be a full investigation. internal and criminal. The department will cooperate completely. The press erupted. Microphones extended. But Amina didn't wait for the storm. She turned, gave one last nod to Ames, and walked back toward the truck with her dogs at her heels. They climbed inside together, the doors closing quietly behind them. The engines of chaos left in her rear view. The courthouse had never been so quiet. Not during the hearings, not during the depositions, and certainly not during Ames's final testimony, which laid bare everything from falsified reports to silent cover-ups stretching back more than a decade. He didn't flinch, not once, even when Deputy Mays glared from the defense table like a man still waiting for someone to save him. But no one did. Not the force, not the community, and not the silence that once protected men like him. By the end of the week, Amina's charges were officially dropped, her record scrubbed clean. A memo issued by the district court admitted wrongful arrest and a critical lapse in protocol. The mayor held a press conference the next day. Standing stiffly beside the county seal, her voice caught somewhere between guilt and damage control, she offered an apology to Amina, public, formal, and practiced. Amina stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, Valor seated calmly at her heel, while Echo rested behind her, eyes never leaving the podium. When the mayor finished, Amina stepped forward. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. "Apologies don't train men like that," she said, her voice even but unmistakable. "They're shaped, fed, allowed. You want change? Start where they begin." Then she turned, gave the dogs a low signal, and walked out of frame before the cameras could catch anything else. That week, the town changed. Not all at once, not loud, but slow, like thaw. Internal Affairs opened investigations into officers who had once been untouchable. Brewer and his crew were charged under federal hate crime statutes, with new victims coming forward almost daily. Mays faced obstruction, conspiracy, and assault under color of law. By month's end, the sheriff's department had been placed under oversight by the state. Tasha, who had been there from the beginning, bruised but unbroken, approached Amina with something more than gratitude. "They're going to try and forget," she said one evening on Amina's porch, a mug of tea in her hand, the sun settling low behind the tree line. "In a few months, this'll all be handled and boxed up. We should make sure they don't get to forget." That conversation became something real. They called it K9 Justice, a nonprofit that paired retired military dogs with veterans recovering from trauma, instability, and the long, quiet wait of what service took without ever asking. The first few dogs were trained in Amina's yard, the training mats placed beside weathered flower beds and old marine photos. Valor and Echo became ambassadors, not just partners, soldiers in peace. And the town began to breathe different air. Not because it healed fully, too much had broken for that, but because people were watching now, listening, asking questions where silence used to sit. Officer Ames stayed on, promoted to lead community liaison, where he worked with civilian oversight groups to build something better. Tasha took meetings with donors and trauma counselors, her voice steady even when she spoke about what was nearly taken from her. And Amina? She didn't chase headlines. She never told her full story to the press. But she walked. She walked with Valor and Echo down that same street where it all began. Different now. Not safer, perhaps, but shifted. The sidewalks still curved clean around driveways. The mailboxes still stood regulation black. But the silence no longer rang hollow. It held something new. One morning, as she rounded the corner near the same block where the fight first sparked, a small voice called out from across the street. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, stood beside her mother, a pink backpack slung over one shoulder, her hand raised in a wave that was both casual and confident. Amina raised a hand in return. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. She didn't scan the yards. She didn't tense at the sound of tires. She simply kept walking. Valor trotted ahead, Echo just behind, and the air around them was calm, not because the world had changed completely, but because she had helped it start. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.